if I did cocaine, it just made me really nervous. It made my nose bleed. So I thought, well, why do I need this?
She was the voice of a generation, Linda Ronstadt, the queen of country rock, the woman who could silence a room with a single note. But behind that golden voice lay decades of silence, not the kind found in music, but the kind born from betrayal. For years, she refused to name names, even as whispers followed her through every backstage door in Hollywood. But now, in her 70s, Linda has finally decided to speak, not with anger, but with clarity, not to destroy, but to reveal. What she remembers isn't fame or applause, it's the sting of arrogance, the cruelty of ego, the way respect can vanish in a single sentence. And at the top of her list stands the man whose sharp tongue cut deeper than any lyric she ever sang. Elvis Costello. Elvis Costello was young, loud, and fearless, the kind of rebel the music industry loved to glorify. But when his arrogance met Linda Ronstadt's quiet strength, sparks turned to poison. In 1979, during a radio interview in Cleveland, Costello mocked her in front of millions, sneering that her music was brunch for rich people. It wasn't just an insult, it was a dismissal of everything she stood for. Linda stayed silent, as she always did. But that silence spoke louder than any headline. Later that night, when they crossed paths backstage, Costello, drunk and defiant, threw another jab before walking away. She didn't respond. Not because she couldn't, but because she knew that talent doesn't need to shout. Years later, Costello apologized publicly, but Linda never commented. To her, forgiveness and respect weren't the same thing, and while that feud would fade with time, the next betrayal cut far deeper, because this time, it came from someone she once called a brother. David Crosby. David Crosby was supposed to be different. To Linda Ronstadt, he wasn't just another rock star, he was family. They came from the same Laurel Canyon circle, shared stages, ideals, and late-night talks about music that meant something. Crosby encouraged her to push boundaries, to stay true to her sound. But fame changes even the kindest faces. During a recording session in 1978, when Linda suggested adjusting a key to fit her voice, Crosby snapped, "Maybe you should learn to adapt instead of changing everything." The words stung. Then came the interviews, Crosby dismissing her as a manufactured voice, implying her success was the product of image, not art. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Linda never confronted him. She simply erased him from her life. Years later, when asked about Crosby, she only said, "Some people forget the music once they start hearing their own echo." But the next blow didn't come from an old friend. It came from a legend. A man who turned idealism into judgment. Neil Young. Neil Young was a symbol of rebellion, a poet with a guitar and a conscience. To Linda Ronstadt, he represented everything true about music: honesty, grit, and freedom. That's why she agreed to perform with him in 1976 at a charity concert for struggling farmers. But the harmony between them shattered the moment the spotlight hit. Young dismissed her song choice as too commercial and cut it from the set list without telling her. On stage, in front of thousands, he mocked her style, saying, "Some singers chase fame, others chase truth." The crowd laughed. Linda didn't. It was the night she realized even the so-called authentic could be cruel. Afterward, she left without a word, tears hidden beneath her sunglasses. Years later, when asked if she'd ever sing with Young again, she replied simply, "No. His freedom cost too many people their dignity." But while Neil wounded her pride, the next man, Frank Zappa, would wound her very soul. And he'd do it in the one place she thought was sacred, the recording studio. Working with Frank Zappa should have been a dream. two musical geniuses from opposite worlds colliding to create something extraordinary. But for Linda Ronstadt, it became a nightmare. Zappa was brilliant, unpredictable, and utterly ruthless in the studio. He mocked her phrasing, called her tone too clean, too polite, and once stopped an entire recording session to sneer, "This is what happens when you give real music to a pop singer." The room went silent. Linda didn't argue. She simply set down her headphones and walked out. Later, when asked about Zappa, she said, "He mistook cruelty for genius." The collaboration never resumed, and the track was buried forever. That day, Linda learned that brilliance without empathy was just another kind of arrogance. But if Zappa's cruelty broke her spirit for a while, the next man she crossed paths with would humiliate her in front of an audience, not in a studio, but on stage, under the blinding lights of Hollywood, and his name was Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was chaos wrapped in poetry. To Linda Ronstadt, he was the embodiment of everything seductive and dangerous about rock and roll, until the night he crossed a line she could never forgive. It was 1968 at the iconic Whiskey A Go-Go Club in Los Angeles. The Doors were performing. The crowd was wild, and Morrison was deep in one of his drunken frenzies. When he spotted Linda near the stage, he pulled her into the spotlight, slurred something unintelligible, and tried to kiss her in front of everyone. The crowd roared, cameras flashed. Linda pushed him away, humiliated and furious, while Morrison stumbled, fell into the mic stand, and laughed it off. The press didn't capture it, but the entire scene became legend among musicians, the night Linda Ronstadt stood up to Jim Morrison. Days later, he mocked her on a radio show, calling her sweet but spineless. She never responded, not out of fear, but out of disgust. Years later, she'd only say, "He was a storm that forgot it could destroy what it touched." Morrison's death a few years later closed that chapter, but the wound stayed. And then came the final betrayal, the one that didn't just bruise her ego but broke her trust completely. That betrayal had a name: Don Henley. Don Henley was the last person Linda Ronstadt ever expected to hurt her. When she met him, he was a shy, ambitious drummer playing in her backing band, a young man with quiet charm and big dreams. Linda believed in him, gave him a stage, and even introduced him to Glenn Frey, the man who would help him form the Eagles. For a while, she was proud. Watching her former bandmates rise to fame felt like watching family succeed. But success has a way of changing people. By 1975, Henley was no longer the humble musician she'd helped. He was the voice of a new American sound, and he'd forgotten who helped him find it. One night, backstage after a show, he smirked and told her, "You should leave songwriting to the real artists." The words landed like a slap. Linda didn't argue, didn't shout. She simply walked away. And the next morning, Henley's name was erased from her tour roster forever. Years later, when asked if she ever forgave him, she replied, "I don't hold grudges, but I remember everything." That was the day Linda Ronstadt stopped believing in loyalty and started believing in silence, because sometimes silence is the only way to end a song. In the years that followed, Linda Ronstadt carried those memories like invisible scars, not as bitterness, but as proof that even legends bleed. Every betrayal, every cruel remark, every moment of public humiliation had shaped her into something the industry could no longer break. The woman who once sang of heartbreaks now lived above them. By the 1980s, she had conquered every genre: country, rock, pop, jazz, even mariachi, and done it all on her own terms. No producers dictating her sound, no critics defining her worth. When asked how she endured so much disrespect and still stayed graceful, She answered softly, "Because dignity is louder than revenge." But time, too, would test her in ways no man ever could. In the 2000s, when Parkinson's disease took away her ability to sing, Linda didn't crumble, she transformed. The silence that once symbolized pain became peace. She began mentoring young musicians, speaking out about women's struggles in the male-dominated music world, and writing honestly about her past, not to reopen wounds, but to show that even broken voices can still tell the truth. Looking back, Linda never named those men out of spite. She did it to reclaim her story. "I didn't hate them," she said. "I just hated what fame turned them into." To her, forgiveness wasn't pretending it didn't happen. It was remembering it and still choosing to stand tall. Today, when people look at Linda Ronstadt, they no longer see the woman surrounded by scandals and feuds. They see a survivor, an artist who turned silence into strength and pain into wisdom. The men she once couldn't forgive have long faded into history. But her legacy endures, untouched and unbent. And as the curtain falls on her story, one truth remains clear. Linda Ronstadt's voice may have gone quiet, but her silence still sings.